We are going to begin looking into the Gospel of Mark, and the place we're going to start is to talk a little bit about authorship. So it's a Gospel according to Mark. Mark who? What Mark? There's no place in the Gospel where the author autographs it, signs it, and so we're working from tradition. And so what is the tradition? Well, there was a church historian by the name of Eusebius in the 4th century. And Eusebius wrote a book called History of the Church, and he attributes the Gospel of Mark to John Mark. How does he get there? Well, again, he's writing in 330, but he is going to quote Papias, who was the bishop of Hierapolis, who wrote a book around 140. We don't have this book, but we have reference to it from Eusebius. And so in 330, Eusebius is quoting Papias, who wrote around 140. And in Papias's work, what he does is he refers to an interview, quote unquote, with John the Elder, who was around 110. So Papias quotes John the Elder in his book, and then Eusebius in his book quotes Papias. And so what John the Elder says is that the writer of the Gospel of Mark is John Mark. Now, what John Mark is he talking about? Well, he's talking about the Mark or the John Mark that we meet in the book of Acts. So in Acts chapter 12, we discover that John Mark is a cousin of Barnabas. And Barnabas and Paul are going to be ones who go on this missionary journey to take the gospel to the Gentiles. They are sent out from the church at Antioch. And John Mark is going to join them in Acts 13 on this first missionary journey. So here is John Mark, Barnabas's likely younger cousin, that is going to go on this first missionary trip with Paul and Barnabas to plant churches. And what happens is that John Mark goes home early. He does the first leg of the journey, and then he's done with it, and he goes back home to Jerusalem, and Paul and Barnabas continue on. Paul and Barnabas complete their missionary endeavor. They return to the church at Antioch. They make a report to Jerusalem, and then the church in Antioch is going to send them out again. In Acts chapter 15, they are going to be sent back out again to revisit the churches that they started, but also to go into new territory. Barnabas wants to take John Mark with them, and Paul says, no way. That he bailed on the first one, we're not going to take him on the second one. Barnabas says, yes, way, we are going to take him. Paul says, no. The division is so sharp that Paul and Barnabas split. And Barnabas is going to take John Mark with him and revisit the churches that they started the first time around. And meanwhile, Paul is going to develop a new team and go into new territory to plant new churches. Now, eventually, we see that Paul and John Mark reconcile. And so when we look at Colossians chapter 4, verse 10, we look in Paul's letter to Philemon, verse 24, we look at 2 Timothy 4:11, what we see is that Paul makes positive references to John Mark and sees John Mark as valuable. And so it looks like reconciliation has taken place. John Mark, in some sense, has proved himself, and he and Paul are on good terms much later in Paul's writings. Okay, so we got that going. Now, maybe most important is we also meet John Mark in 1 Peter. So 1 Peter is a letter that Peter wrote near the end of his life, and he is writing from Rome. And let me go ahead and flip there and just read it to you so that you can hear it. Let me get there. So 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 12 is where I'll start. So this is the end of the letter. By Silvanus, a faithful brother as I regard him, I have written briefly to you, exhorting and declaring that this is the true grace of God. Stand firm in it. Verse 13, key verse. She who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings, and so does Mark, my son. Okay, so here Peter is referring to Mark, and it's the John Mark as his son. Now, he's not biologically his son, but he's his son in terms of one who has been close to Peter, one that Peter has kind of mentored, one that is very near to Peter's heart. And so refers to Mark, John Mark, as his son. Now, she who is in Babylon, they're not literally in Babylon. Babylon here is kind of code for Rome. And so at this point, Peter is in prison in Rome as he writes this letter. And or at least we believe that he's in prison at this time. Oh, goodness. And so he's writing this letter, and he's saying that he's there and that Mark is with him and that Mark sends you greetings as well. And so she who is in Babylon, the church at Rome, that's where Peter's at. And Peter is going to be a martyr there in Rome. And Mark, quote unquote, his son, sends you greetings. So here we see the closeness of Mark to Peter. And we also see the location, that it's Rome. And the general consensus is that the Gospel of Mark is written by Mark, but he gets his information from Peter. And that Mark is addressing, it's written for the church at Rome. So a little bit more, if we look at the quote from Papias, what Papias emphasizes is that Mark wrote down carefully, but not in order, all of the preaching of Peter. That Mark was not an eyewitness of Jesus, but rather he was a follower of Peter's. And so Peter is where Mark is getting his quote unquote eyewitness information from. Mark was not there to hear the Lord, but Peter was. Peter was present, one of the inner disciples. And so the information in Mark is tied to Peter and Peter's witness of it. And Peter would adapt his teaching to the occasion. So Peter didn't write a biography of Jesus. He didn't write a narrative of everything that Jesus said and did from the day of his calling till the day of the crucifixion and resurrection. Rather, Peter adapted the teachings of the Lord, the events that the Lord did, to the occasion as he preached them. And so what Mark does is he takes all that, pulls it together, and organizes it, and creates an orderly presentation, if you will, of Peter's preaching. And just as Peter adapted the teaching, the messages of Jesus to the occasion, so we think Mark is doing that as well. The Mark is pulling all of this together, and he is adapting it to a particular situation, a particular occasion that's taking place in the church at Rome. And so hold on to that thought. Let me erase the board. Let me backtrack just a moment. When Peter wrote 1 Peter, we don't know that he was incarcerated at that time. He was in Rome, but we don't know that the persecution had broken out. But he writes a letter to Christians who are facing persecution in other parts of the empire. Probably that persecution was more social than coming from the Roman government. But he is in Rome as he writes, and Mark is with them, and they are about to head into some tough times in Rome. This is in the early 60s. Nero is the emperor, and there is a fire in Rome. And with that fire, Nero was accused of starting the fire himself so that he could take advantage of it. He could confiscate the property for himself. And so he was under much fire for the fire in Rome. So Nero had to come up with somebody to blame to prove that it wasn't him. And Nero targeted the Christians. The Christians were an odd group. They didn't fit in socially. And so they were kind of an easy target for him to cast blame on. So they become his scapegoat. He blames the Christians for the fire. And to show that he's serious about it, he starts persecuting them. And he doesn't really do an empire-wide persecution so much as a local persecution. It is intense, and he is blaming that fire on Christians. And so he is putting them to death and burning Christians at the stake. So Peter gets caught in this, and Peter becomes a martyr under Nero in the mid-60s. And so we think that this is the occasion for the Gospel of Mark. So up until this point, there's really no need to write a gospel because you have the preaching of Peter. And as long as Peter is alive and well and preaching, there's no need to write down everything that he preached, everything that he remembers about Jesus. No need for that because you have the living Peter. But when you have the death of Peter or the impending death of Peter, and and it is certain that Peter is going to be martyred or executed, all of a sudden there becomes this need in order to write down, to record, to preserve Peter's witness. So the occasion of the Gospel of Mark, why was this gospel produced? What was the occasion that kind of called it forth? Well, we think it is the death of Peter and the persecution of the church at Rome. And so what we will see is that Mark will take the preachings of Peter and not only record them, but also kind of follow in Peter's steps and adapt them for the occasion to address the church at Rome. So the occasion, what was going on in the world that, moved Mark, or the Holy Spirit moves Mark and says, hey, look at what's going on, you need to write. Well, I think it's the death of Peter and the persecution that the church was facing in Rome from Nero. The purpose of it is threefold. So purpose number one is to preserve Peter's eyewitness. And so without Peter, you're going to lose a major eyewitness to Jesus, his teachings. And so Mark is going to record the memories, if you will, the preaching of Peter, and he's going to give it an organization so that it's easy to remember and it communicates some important truth about Jesus, about salvation. Okay, so number one, purpose, we lost Peter, so we need to preserve his witness. We need to put down in writing his preaching so the church will have it. Second thing we see, in this context of persecution, what Mark is doing is he is trying to motivate faithfulness. He wants to motivate the church at Rome to be faithful no matter what the cost. If it costs them their lives, they need to follow through. And so to do that, he is going to tell the story of Jesus. And so he's going to highlight Jesus' teaching of the cross. He's going to highlight how Jesus goes to the cross and how it's when Jesus is on the cross and dying. That's when the Roman centurion says, surely this was the Son of God. And so Mark is trying to motivate the church at Rome that no matter how costly it might be, it might even cost them their lives, that they are going to follow through and be faithful to Jesus. They're going to take up their cross. They're going to imitate Jesus, that Jesus gave his life for them. They ought to give their lives out of faithfulness to Jesus. So that's purpose number two, not simply to preserve what Peter remembers and what Peter preached, but actually to motivate this faithfulness to Jesus in the time of this intense persecution. Purpose number three, motivate the giving of second chances to believers who failed at number two. To motivate the giving of second chances to those believers who, in the face of persecution, they compromised and they denied knowing Jesus as their Lord and Savior. The goal here is restoration, that the church would be a place where disciples who failed could be restored, rather than simply being a club, if you will, of those who were faithful in the face of persecution. And if you weren't faithful, you're out and you're lost and you're never welcome back. No, Mark wants them to be a church of second chances. Okay, and so whose story is he going to tell? He tells the story of Peter. And so he tells the story of Peter and how Peter denied knowing Jesus, how Peter was slow to get it. Peter stumbles all through the Gospel of Mark. And he's kind of the leader of the disciples, but at the same time, he is very blind. At the same time, he is very resistant to Jesus, especially Jesus going to the cross. And then when Jesus is arrested and under trial and being faithful, Peter is questioned by servant girls and denies even knowing Jesus, never having met him, not being one of his followers. So Peter fails miserably. And yet, what does the church at Rome know? The church at Rome knows that Peter was transformed. The church at Rome is witnessing Peter giving his life in faithfulness to Jesus. And so the church at Rome sees sees Peter transformed. And what Mark does is he reminds them where Peter came from, that Peter had been a failure, that this saint that's in front of them now, faithful and giving his life for Christ, that very person failed miserably. And so Peter reminds him of that Mark reminds him of that by telling Peter's story. Okay, and Mark himself also knows this because on his first missionary journey, what did Mark do? He bailed out, he went home, he quit, but he was restored. And now he's writing this gospel in a context of persecution. So when you think about the Gospel of Mark, kind of occasion and purpose, how did this gospel come to be? Why was it written? What situation was it speaking into? Well, it was that situation in Rome of persecution. Peter being martyred, being executed as a witness to Christ, and other believers in the church facing persecution. And so what Mark does is he preserves the preaching of Peter, organizes it into this gospel, and organizes it in such a way not only to record it, but to motivate faithfulness no matter what the cost, but also to motivate the giving of second chances to those who failed like Peter did, like Mark did, those who failed in the face of persecution. So keep that in mind as you read and as you work through the Gospel of Mark, and I think you'll see, you'll gain a lot of fruit from this approach and kind of recognizing how Mark would speak to that church at Rome. Maybe that will help us better hear how Mark speaks to us today, or the Spirit speaks to us through Mark. Okay, let me go ahead and erase the board. I want us to take a quick look at kind of the outline of Mark, the big chunks of it. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're trying to look at the Gospel of Mark in terms of really big chunks. And there are three major chunks in the Gospel of Mark. So chunk number one is pretty much the first half of the Gospel. So from chapter 1 all the way through chapter 8, verse 30, there's one question that kind of governs everything. And that question is, who is Jesus? Now, Mark tells us right at the very get-go that this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God. So right off the bat, Mark tells us who Jesus is, that he is the Son of God, that he's the Messiah, that he's the Christ, and we're going to get an account of that. Okay, but all the characters in the gospel, they don't know this. So we, the readers, know it. What we discover is that the demons know it, that the wind and the waves know it, but all the characters don't know it. And so this is what they're wrestling with. Who is Jesus? Who is this guy? When Jesus says to the paralytic, your sins are forgiven, all the Pharisees are raising the question, who is this guy? Only God can forgive sins. When Jesus speaks to the wind and the waves and calms them, the disciples are wondering, who is this guy? We've never seen anyone with authority like this. Jesus cast out demons. Again, everybody's wondering, who is this guy? We've never seen anybody with authority like this. With his teaching, nobody's ever seen anybody teach like that with authority the way that Jesus taught. And so that's the big question all the way through the first 8 chapters is, who is Jesus? Who is this guy? His incredible authority over wind, waves, over sin, over demons, the way he teaches, authority over the Sabbath. Who is this guy? So that's the question that keeps getting raised over and over in the first 8 chapters. Then in the middle section that actually starts at 8:31, some would start it even sooner at 8:22, and it runs through chapter 10. Then the question becomes, how will Jesus bring God's kingdom? So the question gets answered that Jesus is the Christ. And so that gets answered by Peter. Jesus says, okay, Peter, who do you say that I am? This conversation starts at 8:27. Jesus pulls them aside, the disciples, who do people say that I am? And then finally to Peter, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you're the Christ, about 8:29. And Jesus says, okay, don't tell anyone. And then we have this new place, 8:31. Jesus begins to teach plainly that he is going to go to Jerusalem, that he's going to be handed over, that he's going to suffer, that he's going to be executed, and on the third day he will be raised. He is teaching that the kingdom will come through his cross. Okay, this is the question that gets wrestled with in the rest of 8, all of 9, all of 10. Jesus, speaking as a disciple, Jesus, we get it now. You're the king. And so Jesus begins to try to teach them how his kingdom is going to come. That's kind of the governing question, if you will. And the disciples are just absolutely confused about it. That they think the kingdom is going to come like any other kingdom comes in terms of kind of political power, that the king is going to be exalted, that the king is not going to give his life. And so Jesus is trying to teach the cross, much confusion by the disciples. Could be argued that they just don't get it even when we get to the end. They finally get it that he's the Christ. They never quite get that he's going to bring his kingdom through his cross. Then, chapter 11, Jesus enters into Jerusalem as the king. And chapters 11 through 16, it's the story of his time in Jerusalem, the story of his death on the cross. 16, the empty tomb, and then added addition accounts of his resurrection. And so 11 through 16 is kind of the story, if you will, of Jesus bringing God's kingdom, of Jesus going to the cross and the kingdom coming. So again, just trying to help you think big picture, Gospel of Mark. First half, who is Jesus? Okay, we know, the readers know, but nobody else can figure it out yet. He's got authority, but they can't figure it out. Finally, they figure out he is the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. And he starts to teach them about his cross. And so the focus shifts from who is Jesus to how will Jesus bring God's kingdom. And Jesus teaches that he will bring God's kingdom through giving his life, through going to the cross. And the disciples just don't get it. Finally, we get to chapter 11. Jesus enters into Jerusalem, and we have the account of him going to the cross, of bringing God's kingdom. And that centurion who's overseeing the execution of Jesus, he makes a confession that surely Jesus was the Son of God. Kind of interesting, again, just thinking big picture. Mark tells us at the beginning who Jesus is. This is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the Messiah, the Son of God. And then in the middle of the gospel, Peter finally sees, you're the Messiah, you're the Christ. And then at the end of the gospel, it's a Roman centurion who says, surely this was the Son of God. So Mark tells us at the beginning, Peter kind of gets it in the middle, you're the Christ. And then the centurion gets it at the end, you're the Son of, this was the Son of God. Surely was the Son of God. When he sees how Jesus died, kingdom comes. Okay, so just big picture, trying to help you think about the whole. And again, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the synoptics. And so you'll find something very similar in Matthew and Luke as they tell the story, where the first half is about Jesus' ministry in Galilee. And that's another way you could divide this up in terms of location. So kind of this geographical movement towards Jerusalem. So these first 8 chapters take place largely in Galilee, which is the northern part of Judea or Palestine. And then chapters 8 to 10, it's about a journey to Jerusalem. So the ministry in Galilee, the journey towards Jerusalem, and then finally chapter 11 to 16, the time in Jerusalem. So kind of a geographical layout too, where geographically we're moving towards Jerusalem, moving towards the place of crucifixion. Again, Matthew and Luke also have this same pattern of the Galilean ministry, then the journey time, and then finally the time in Jerusalem. So kind of a synoptic perspective. John is different, but we'll save that for a later day. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is miracles. And so let me go ahead and put you on pause for a moment, do a few things to the board, and we'll come back and we'll talk about miracles. Okay, again, thinking big picture, Gospel of Mark, and I've adjusted our passages just a little bit. So now we're talking this first section in terms of chapter 1 through 8:21, and 22 to 26 is kind of a hinge passage that's beginning to shift us into the middle section. So that's why I made the adjustment. Now we're going to talk about miracles, and you'll see why I made that adjustment here in a moment. So there are 18 miracles that are narrated in the Gospel of Mark, specific miracles that are narrated. And I'm not counting the resurrection here as a miracle. So there are 18 specific miracles that Jesus did that are narrated in the Gospel of Mark. Of those 18, there are 2 that are feedings. Jesus fed the 5,000 and then he fed the 4,000. And in just a moment, we'll take a quick look at Jesus feeding the 5,000. Okay, but 2 feeding miracles out of the 18 fed the 5,000 and then fed the 4,000. There are 3 nature miracles. Okay, one is Jesus walking on water. Another one is Jesus calming the wind and the waves. And the third one is Jesus cursed the fig tree. Okay, so 3 miracles that have to do with nature: walking on water, calming the wind and the waves, and then cursing the fig tree. Then there are 13 healings. Okay, 13 specific occasions where Jesus heals somebody. And out of those 13 healings, 4 of them are exorcisms, where he casts out demons. So total of 18, 2 feedings, 3 nature, and 13 healings. And then, so there's our 18. And then within those 13 healings, there are 4 exorcisms. And these exorcisms always come at kind of a critical time, kind of a beginning time, if you will. So when Jesus starts his ministry, his first miracle is an exorcism. When Jesus goes into new territory, first thing that happens, an exorcism. And so there are 4 of these exorcisms, and one of them is right in the middle here in terms of how Jesus will bring the kingdom. So in terms of where they're spaced out in the gospel, again, this is quite interesting. 14 out of the 18 miracles occur in chapter 1 through 8:21. Okay, so very front loaded. So 14 out of the 18 miracles are happening in these first 8 chapters up to chapter 8, verse 21. Then we get, well, you can see the role that they would play, that those miracles keep raising the question, who is this guy? We've never seen anybody do anything like this, so who is he? And so the miracles help kind of provoke the question, if you will, where you have to come to terms with who is this guy that has the power to do these things, to cast out demons, to calm wind and waves, to walk on water, to heal people. Who is this guy? Middle section has 3 miracles. Okay, twice Jesus heals the blind. Once at the beginning in 8:22, that's why I bumped it here. And then at the end of chapter 10, Jesus heals another blind person. So this section, how will Jesus bring God's kingdom? It is framed by Jesus healing men who are blind. And then right in the middle of it, you have an exorcism. So healing of a blind, an exorcism, healing of another blind man. And we're going to look at those in a later lecture here. And then the last miracle is in 11 through 16, and it occurs where Jesus has entered into Jerusalem. He goes back out. Next day, he's coming in. He sees the fig tree has no fruit on it. He curses it. They pass on by. They come on back, and it is withered from the roots. And so that's the last miracle that Jesus does. And kind of a downer for a last miracle. But the resurrection's coming. But again, we're not counting that as one of the miracles that Jesus did. So Gospel of Mark has 18 miracles, heavily loaded in the front, 14. They raise the question, who is Jesus? And then the middle section has 3 miracles, and then the last section, just 1. What do the miracles mean? Okay, so the question is not, did they really happen or not? Okay, that would be kind of a modern question where we're trying to figure out, did they really happen? How did they really happen? But if we jump back into their world, that was never the question, did it happen? The question is, okay, it happened, so what? What difference does it make that it happened? What difference does it make that Jesus healed, that Jesus cast out demons, that Jesus walked on water? What difference does that make? What do the miracles mean? So it's not, did they happen, as much as, okay, they happened, but so what? And so what did the miracles mean? 2 things that they should point us to. So number 1, they should point us to this question of who is Jesus, that Jesus is the Christ, that he is the Son of God, that he's the Messiah, that he's the Anointed One. So the miracles are designed to help us better see who Jesus is and to come to terms with who Jesus is. The second thing the miracles do is that they are to help us see that it's through Jesus that God's kingdom comes. Okay, that Jesus is the king who brings God's kingdom. And so remember our eschatology about how there is, healing and resurrection and life in that age to come. So when Jesus does a miracle, he's basically bringing that age to come into the present. so that someone begins to experience that future age in the present lifetime, whether that be forgiveness, whether that be healing. Jesus raises, brings some people back to life. And so all of that is designed to show that Jesus is the one who is bringing God's future into the present. Okay, so I want to take just a few moments to look at the feeding of the 5,000. And so hopefully you have a Bible close by. It's in Mark chapter 6. And let me go ahead and read this to us. And then I want to highlight a couple things. So Gospel of Mark chapter 6, beginning at verse 30. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And Jesus said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them. Why? Because they were like sheep without a shepherd. You might want to underline that. Jesus had compassion on them. They were like sheep without a shepherd. And Jesus began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But Jesus answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" A denarii was about a day's wages. And Jesus said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then Jesus commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by fifties. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate, and they were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Okay, so a couple things I want to think about with this. There's lots of lessons in this miracle. So one lesson might be that, Jesus saw the need and he had compassion upon the people, and it's late in the day, and he says, okay, we need to feed these people, you feed them. And many churches take from this that, yes, we need to have compassion upon people, upon their physical needs. We need to care for them. We need to feed them. And some have taken this miracle as a sign, a lesson that the church really needs to be about caring for the physical needs of people. Okay, and I get that. That's part of it. But most of these people were not, quote unquote, homeless. They all had homes that they could be sent home to. They had come out from their homes to hear Jesus. So while I agree that it's important to show compassion and to care for people and to meet their physical needs, I don't know that that's the main thing that this is about. Okay, it's also said that, the disciples' response was, where are we going to get, enough food for all these people? Do you really want us to go out and spend 200 denarii to try to get that money, get that much food for them? And so they're focused on what they don't have. But Jesus' question is, what do you have? Go find out. And so rather than, having a focus on what we don't have, we need to be focused on what we actually do have. And even more, what we do have, we need to give it to Jesus. Okay, and so some would say that that's the major lesson of this miracle, that we need to have a major shift of focus. Instead of kind of deficit thinking in terms of what we don't have, we need to be thinking in terms of what we do have, and even more, recognizing that what we have, we need to give it to Jesus. And if we give it to Jesus, Jesus will make sure that it's more than enough for whatever the challenge might be. Okay, important lesson, absolutely. But I still don't think that that's the main thing. Some would say that what's really significant is that Jesus involves the disciples. You feed them, give me what you have. And then Jesus takes it and blesses it and gives it back to the disciples and tells them to go distribute it. And then has the disciples pick up the leftovers. And so that Jesus doesn't do this ministry or this miracle kind of by himself, but Jesus incorporates the disciples so that they participate in it. And some would say that this is a major lesson. And I agree, it's a major lesson, but I don't think it's the lesson. But it's a major lesson in terms of the kingdom comes and Jesus invites us to participate in its coming. There's work for us to do. Okay, well, you're saying, okay, well, those are all great things, and yet I still don't think those are the main things. Yeah. Well, what is the main thing? Well, the miracles are designed to help us better see Jesus. And did you notice that Jesus saw the people and they were like sheep without a shepherd? And so he began to teach them. Didn't feed them first, began to teach them. And it's only when it gets late in the day that he has this miracle of feeding. And I think that that was actually part of the lesson. Did you notice where Jesus has them sit? I know, sit down on the ground, but did you pay attention to Mark's details? Sat on the green grass. They were like people, like sheep without a shepherd, and Jesus has them sit on the green grass. Now, I don't know if you know Psalm 23 or not, but the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. Okay, are you getting it? What Mark is saying, what Jesus is teaching through this miracle, and what Mark is communicating as he remembers the details, or remembers Peter preaching the details, Jesus is the shepherd. And shepherd is an imagery for king, for Messiah, that the Lord says in Ezekiel, I will come and shepherd my people myself as a king. So shepherd imagery is king imagery. And so when the people are like sheep without a shepherd, it's like they have no leader, they have no king, they need the Messiah to come. And Jesus organizes them and teaches them and has them sit on the green grass, and he provides for them. It's like Jesus is their shepherd. So this is a miracle that points us to who Jesus is, that he is that good shepherd that takes care of the flock. And then just kind of adding to that, in Isaiah, we have prophecy that in the days to come, there's going to be this feast, this banquet, and everybody is going to be satisfied from this feast. And how does Mark end this? They were all satisfied. That Jesus kind of quenched their hunger, and there was this deep satisfaction. Now, it's temporary, sure, that especially if they have teenagers, they're going to be hungry by the time they get home. Okay, but in the moment, there is this miracle which reveals who Jesus is, the good shepherd, the one who truly satisfies. See, I think that's the way we need to approach all the miracles. That, yeah, we're thinking about what happened and the lessons that can be learned, but the big issue, how do these miracles point us to who Jesus is? How do these miracles demonstrate that it's exactly in and through Jesus that God's future becomes present, that God's kingdom comes? See, that's the so what of the miracles. So I would challenge you that as you read through the Gospels and as you come to these miracles, you kind of stop and pause and say, okay, so what? That your question isn't, did this happen? Your question is, so what difference does it make that it did happen, that Jesus did do this? And it reveals that he's the Messiah. It reveals that he's the one who brings God's future into the present. Okay, well, that's it for this one. We got more to do with Mark, but going to cut this one off, and I'll see you in the next one. And thank you for watching and for following along.